Continue to unpack this delicate matter. I'm joined by former Wits student leader Fasiha Hassan, of course, one of the leaders of the Fees Must Fall movement. Fasiha, thank you so much for your time this evening. Protests that started in earnest in 2017 under the Fees Must Fall movement are essentially still ongoing. I don't think we've seen a year since then when we haven't seen in some part of South Africa serious student protests pretty much over the same issues. They haven't been resolved yet. What do you think the major holdup is in trying to resolve the concerns of the majority of students who continue to face economic and financial exclusion?
Evening, Hanli. I think you really hit the nail on its head there. It's something that we protest even before 2015-16 up to now. It's been a huge challenge. And really what this should show us is that these issues are structural. They're not particular to one university. Of course, it's more acute in some universities as opposed to others, but it does show us the need for structural intervention. And there's a number of things. It's something I feel like I'm saying the same things I did almost in 2015-16 as I am now. Part of that is around different types of funding for higher education, which we know is chronically underfunded. I've said this before as well. Institutional autonomy is fundamental and must be protected. But at the same time, there's some drawbacks. And one of those drawbacks is that universities are still able to determine their fee structure very differently. And so it can be, which is now the case, where NSFAS covers up to a certain amount, the university covers a higher or calls for a high amount, or the university accommodation is more expensive. And then you get all these gap spaces in which many people then create historic debt or debt that they just can't pay off. And then you have people who are financially excluded. So there's a number of different interventions that are needed, one of which could be a standardization of fees. Sure, that's one argument. I think it can be spoken about. But there's a bigger one to talk about the state funding, number two, but also around the role of the private sector. And this is something that we don't really invest enough time into looking into. So often you'll find a big corporation giving out 10, 20 bursaries, in the box, wow, we've done great. But in reality, that's a drop in the ocean of what they could really invest in higher education. They get the best graduates, but they're not as involved in the funding of higher education in different ways. So these are different options. But the point really is, it was before 2015, it was then, it's now, and something has to give, something has to change so that every year we don't have the same conversations.
Free higher education is still a complete pipe dream, despite promises being made towards making that a reality. In your view, does the government take the role played by higher education in economic growth seriously enough? Because we see the direct impact of people being excluded from higher education, not being able to access economic opportunities, and the entire country's growth suffering as a result.
Right now, we're having different various forms of load shedding, stage 5, 6, rising cost of living. I think everybody's at a point where there's either water shortage or electricity shortage. And if this is not showing us that the country needs skills, it needs capacitated people, it needs young people to connect their struggles or their work at a university or higher education level to the problems even of the economy, then I don't know what more needs to happen, not just for the state, but for all the different role players, whether they're universities, whether it's DHET, whether I said earlier, the private sector. If we all can't see the value of a public good that is free education, then perhaps we also need to introspect about what those solutions look like. Because right now, something really does have to give. And we can't be shocked that students are protesting again. How many of us at home are struggling with that rising cost of living? That missing middle group, which also we don't talk about enough, who don't qualify for NSFAS, but also don't qualify for bank loans, who are really struggling to pay off their cars, their homes, and now the added cost of university fees. I mean, it really is a crunch. So for me, I'm not shocked, unfortunately. I wish I was by what's happening, but it really does overemphasize the fact that maybe now it's time for legislation. Maybe it's now time to force everyone to play their role. Maybe it's now time to also say to universities, well, you can't just determine your fee structure on your own. DHET, you're not doing enough. And really, it's something that I really hope and believe from when it was 2015 to now, that this call for free, quality, decolonized education does not fall on deaf ears. And I say this also only as a lawmaker. I say this as a young person who's gone through the same things we're seeing on our screen now, is in the legislature, in parliament, etc., fighting for very much the same issues, perhaps from a different lens, and perhaps also continuously being blue in the face from saying the same thing over and over again.
Do we see the same protests and struggles at different institutions of higher learning? It seems that in the mainstream media, we report largely on protests at universities. I know in the past we've seen large-scale and sometimes even very violent protest at technicons. I know the technicon in Durban has been problematic in the past. We've seen a number of protests there, but we don't often hear in the mainstream media about protests and student activations at TVET colleges or at institutions of higher learning where perhaps the fields of study are more related directly to trades, where they're not quite as academic of nature. Would you agree? I mean, as someone who's been in the student movement for a long time, do you have knowledge of protests right through the different types of institutions?
Definitely. And I think it's something that even eNCA, all of us need to reflect on, that we only seem to report when it's a more, inverted commas, Ivy League institution that is, in fact, protesting. If you look at TUT, a Univen, the DUT, you mentioned it, there's so often protests in those spaces. Even in TVET colleges, the lack of resourcing, the lack of capacity, the fact that they protest very regularly and it doesn't come across our screens. And in many ways, we should be focusing a lot on TVETs because one of the big parts of solving the economic crisis in the country is vocational and very specific skills training, even around solving youth unemployment. So it is something that we need to look at. And I think we also need to look at it through a very fair lens. So often, not just today, but throughout the week, you've heard so many people complaining, oh, the traffic is backed up. Oh, students at it protesting again. I think we need to understand that people don't protest as a first point of call. It is a last resort, and it is after so many attempts to try and fix a very broken system. And also students, we must be very open and honest. I mean, they don't have the kind of financial capacity that professionals have, that other people might have in society. And so in many ways, their only tool to voice their concerns after failed negotiations is going to the streets. And I want us as society to look at it as a form of young people really wanting an education. They're fighting that it shouldn't depend on the amount of money that you have in your pocket. That shouldn't determine your educational outcome or what your economic fate should be. They're fighting for a structural change. And when we look at it through that lens, I think you then begin to understand the desperation and the pain that students are going through, because they should not have to go to the streets. They should not have to go through all of this. I know the media is being harassed at Wits University, and it's a worry. It's an extreme worry for all of us that, again, we're sitting in this situation. And really, it is something that we need to not just protect students from, but create a new future for young people in South Africa. And the students who are protesting now are really trying to do that. And I want us to look at it for what it is.
So the ideologies of student leaders have focal points that are very indicative of the social challenges particular to that time. They tend to change over time to reflect those sociological changes. Sometimes that change and those changes in ideology are very minor over, let's say, decades, and you can only really see those major changes play out over 100 years, for instance. But in the role that you've played since 2015, you say, have you seen any changes in the nuances of those focal points of these student ideologies that tell us whether we're making any kind of progress or whether the things that students want and need have changed in any way, that perhaps we're not looking at it in a nuanced enough fashion?
I agree we're not looking at it in a nuanced enough fashion there. I agree with you. Has it fundamentally changed? Probably not. And the reason why it probably hasn't fundamentally changed is that the issues haven't changed. The problems haven't changed. Students are still sleeping in libraries. Students are still very food insecure. Quite a number of NSFAS beneficiaries, the stipend they get from NSFAS, they send home to their communities, etc., etc. And so if the core problem doesn't shift or evolve, very similarly, you'll have similar reactions, etc. Where you're seeing something somewhat different, and I mean, there's a big debate on this. Is fallism an ideology? Is it not? isn't necessarily in my opinion, but you do see this rise of this kind of fallist politics, and that's a very interesting thing, because a lot of people will ask us, well, what are we building in its place? And that's a very big conversation to have. But I agree, if you don't look at it from a nuanced perspective, you'll easily come to a conclusion and say, students are just protesting, they haven't passed their subjects, they just want, or they have a sense of entitlement, etc., without really fully understanding the context, the circuit of how things work, but also understanding that there's a much bigger thing that students are fighting for, and it's not even about themselves. It's about the future of this country, and I'm going to keep saying that, because if we don't fix the education system, it's very hard for us to fix the economic system. If we don't fix the economic system, it's very hard for us to deal with all these other different service delivery, etc., etc. So everything is holistic, everything is intersectional, and if we isolate one element of that system and think, we'll just vilify this, I don't think we're going to come to any sort of conclusions, or any positive or progressive conclusions. Let me say that.
Thank you so much for your insights this evening. That was former Wits student leader Fasiha Hassan talking to us from her experience, reflecting on the issues currently faced by students at Wits and all across the country.